Today, 8th August, I'm going to deal firstly in this program with the situation in the Middle East, where I will have a few things to say about recent developments, and then the bulk of my program will return to a discussion of the crisis in Ukraine, the fighting in Russia's Kursk region, the events elsewhere on the contact line, and the likely political repercussions of recent events there. But let me first of all begin with the situation in the Middle East. And I do so because there have been media reports circulating in the United States that after sustained American diplomatic pressure on Iran, the Iranian authorities are supposedly reconsidering their plans to respond against Israel, multi-pronged attacks on Israel and that kind of thing. Supposedly, the Iranians are now in the process of reviewing what they're going to do after American warnings that if they do proceed with the kind of action that the Americans fear, well, that might oblige the United States to take Israel's side, in which case Iran and the United States will in effect be at war with each other. Well, that may be true, but I have to say straight away that Iranian media reports, which are all that I have at the moment, and statements from Iranian officials show no sign of any change of direction from Iran up to this time about what Iran is proposing to do. Now, to give just one example, yesterday, the foreign ministry, the Iranian foreign ministry spokesman, Nasser Kanani, posted on his X account various comments about the general situation in the Middle East, and he seemed to be taking a completely uncompromising position about Israel and about Iran's own actions. Now, I should make it clear that in this latest post, Kanani was not referring to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, though that does lie in the background, obviously, of every and any Iranian statement. But he was referring instead to some extraordinary comments by the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, one of the extreme religious hardliners in the Israeli government, who basically made comments about how starving millions of people in Gaza would be a moral and justifiable thing to do. But alas, Israel can't do it because of the international reaction. These comments have provoked strong words, not just from Iran, by the way, but even from some European officials. Josep Borrell, the European Union's foreign minister, has condemned them, as has the spokesman of the German government. And, there have been other criticisms from others. By the way, Smotrich's comments, as far as I'm concerned, are little different from any other comments that have been made by Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu himself, other Israeli officials. I remain baffled that the ICC, whilst taking action against Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Gallant, and Gallant, by Israeli standards, is almost a moderate in this conflict, has so far shown no interest in bringing or issuing arrest warrants against Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. I ought to say that I've been reading some comments about Ben-Gvir specifically, which are frankly extremely disturbing. There were some claims yesterday about how there was violence carried out by some Israeli police against various Palestinian prisoners, and supposedly the event was live streamed. This attack by the policemen was live streamed, and the implication of the words that I have seen are that that the live streaming was being conducted for Ben Gvir's actual benefit. Now, I'm not sure whether this is really the case, but anyway, there it is. I mean, this is a comment that I've seen. It's appeared, by the way, in The Guardian. I'm not sure to what extent this is true, but there it is. It does appear to be fairly well documented, and if so, then I would have thought that Ben Gvir at least would be somebody that the judicial authorities in The Hague ought certainly to be taking an interest in. I'm going to read the comment, as I said, it's in The Guardian. Musa Arsi, a 58-year-old painter, decorator and father of 4, said he heard guards beat 38-year-old Thayer Abu Asab to death in a neighbouring cell at Ketziot in November. One guard told 50-year-old Firas Hassan from Bethlehem, "We are live streaming this for Ben Gvir." Now, you can make of that what you will. It perhaps isn't particularly well sourced. There is witness evidence here, and The Guardian apparently contacted Ben Gvir's spokesman to try to elicit comments, but doesn't seem to have obtained them anyway. I'm not going to dwell on this. But anyway, Smotrich's words, for what they're worth, they seem to be pretty standard to me amongst the various things that various Israeli officials have been saying ever since the events of last October and even before. Anyway, let's move on and go to what Kanani said in response to those. But as I said, his words in this post do seem to me to cover also the probable response of Iran to the assassination of Haniyeh. Anyway, in the post on X, Kanani said that the Israeli regime knows no boundaries for its heinous crimes and measures, that remarks by Israeli officials, he's now referring to Smotrich, deserve international prosecution, and then Kanani importantly goes on to say that there is nothing going to stop the Israelis unless strong pressure and decisive and deterrent action is taken against them. The regime, that's to say Israel, will be forced to comply with international rules only if it faces pressure and decisive and deterrent action. And that seems to me to hint at decisive and deterrent action from Israel, not just over the assassination of from Iran rather, not just in connection with the assassination of Haniyeh, but also, not just in connection with the comments by Smotrich, but also in connection with the assassination of Haniyeh. So I don't see so far any sign of any softening of the Iranian position, any weakening of American resolve. I wonder whether these comments from the United States are just examples of wishful thinking. Just saying. Anyway, yesterday, the Organization for the Islamic Conference, to call it, I think, by its proper name, had its meeting, which was hosted in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. The meeting was convened at the request of Iran and Palestine following the assassination of Haniyeh, and the Islamic Conference, or rather, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, claims for itself the position of the voice of the Muslim world. And predictably, a statement was issued. And I'm taking this now from Al Jazeera. The statement issued after an extraordinary meeting of the 57-member bloc, that's the OIC, on Wednesday, said it holds Israel, the illegal occupying power, fully responsible for the heinous attack, that's to say the assassination on Haniyeh, which it describes as a serious infringement of Iran's sovereignty. The Foreign Minister of Gambia, Mamadou Tangara, who's the current chairman of the OIC, said Haniyeh's heinous assassination and the ongoing war in Gaza could lead to a regional conflict. The aggression, and this is Tangara's words, the aggression and violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Islamic Republic of Iran by the assassination of a political leader on its soil is an act that cannot be viewed in isolation. This heinous act serves only to escalate the existing tensions, potentially leading to a wider conflict that could involve the entire region. And Saudi Arabia also made some strong comments. The Saudi Deputy Foreign Minister, Walid El-Khareji, said Saudi Arabia rejects any violation of the sovereignty of states or interference in the internal affairs of any country, and made it clear that, again, that Saudi Arabia strongly opposes what happened, the assassination of Haniyeh, in the way that was done. So the Iranians now have their statement from the OIC. And as I said, I've always taken the view that they would not act before they got it. They would not want more moderate or historically pro-Western Arab countries peeling away before, if as a result of any action that they have taken. They would want a strong statement from all of the Islamic countries, including countries like Saudi Arabia, which will lock all of these Arab countries, moderate countries, Islamic countries, into a position of support for Iran, thereby giving Iran the political space to take whatever action it has decided to take. So we will see what Iran does. It might not happen immediately. The last time, as I remember, Iran took some time to respond. And if we're talking about deployments of missiles in third countries, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and other places, well, that by definition will take a certain amount of time. But that a retaliation of some sort is coming, I still believe. And as I said, Iranian statements like the one by Kanani that I've just discussed basically shows this. Anyway, there we are. That's what I'm going to say about the situation in the Middle East. Now, there's much more discussion and commentary over the last 24 hours about the situation in Ukraine and in Kursk region, except perhaps somewhat surprisingly in the Western media. The Western media are saying remarkably little about the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk region. I mean, usually when incursions like this take place, the Western media jumps on them and cheers them on, even if on occasion the Ukrainians have indulged themselves in the fiction that the incursion in question is being conducted not by themselves, but by dissident Russian fighters. a threadbare claim at all times, by the way. But this time, the Western media is saying as little about this particular incursion as it can get away with, which I find interesting and rather suggestive. And the United States, for what it's worth, also seems to be going out of its way to distance itself from what the Ukrainians are doing. There are reports appearing in the US media, the Wall Street Journal and other newspapers, that the United States was not informed in advance by Ukraine of its latest incursion into Russia, that the United States is trying to find out from the Ukrainians what it is exactly that they're up to. And the United States clearly doesn't seem to be very keen to associate itself with this particular operation. And despite that, notwithstanding all of this, the United States says nonetheless that the United States is not going to change its policy with respect to arms deliveries to Ukraine, despite the fact that there is irrefutable evidence that American weapons, Stryker armored vehicles and all that kind of thing, are operating on the territory of Russia, several kilometers inside Russia, in an area that is some distance from Kharkiv region, and in a way that is completely unrelated to the fighting in Kharkiv region, which is the only area where the United States has supposedly authorized the Ukrainians to use their weapons inside Russia. I think that there is a reason why the United States is trying to distance itself from this event, and I'm going to discuss it shortly. But before I do, let's actually discuss what is going on, or what I think is going on. And I say I think what is going on because there is an astonishing amount of fog of war about events. Now, we do have some photographic and film evidence, which is important and interesting, and which we will soon discuss. But I have to say also that one of the things that isn't helping in this matter is that there's been an enormous amount of reporting, or excited reporting, from all sorts of sources, which have given, I think, a very dramatic picture of the events in Kursk region, which might not actually reflect the reality. And here I have to say that I think a particular source of a lot of this reporting is the Russian reporting agency, RIBA. Now, RIBA is a reporting agency that I, for one, take extremely seriously. They have provided a huge amount of very important and valuable information about the situation in the conflict in the past. They have their share of critics, but I, as I said, take them seriously. And I think, on balance, they provided information that has been, helpful in understanding the conflict. RIBA does, however, have some certain characteristics. Firstly, it tends to be very critical, or unusually critical for Russian sides, of the Russian High Command. In fact, it has a tendency, which I can at times find a little surprising, to try to second guess what the Russian High Command should do, and even to provide the Russian High Command with advice, despite the fact that I'm not sure that RIBA, which cannot have the kind of information the Russian High Command has, doesn't seem to me to be the sort of agency that's really in a position to provide advice. But that is what they do tend to do. And alongside that, from time to time, they have had a certain tendency to catastrophize. They did that, for example, very notably during the Krinky operation and in advance of the Krinky operation, where they seem to be anticipating a major Ukrainian offensive on the east bank, the Russian-controlled east bank of the Dnieper River last autumn, which never really materialized. Just saying. So what they say does sometimes need to be taken with a measure of, shall we say, skepticism. And all of yesterday and the day before, they were giving all kinds of reports and claims, making all sorts of claims that large numbers of settlements had fallen under Ukrainian control, that the Ukrainians were advancing almost unopposed deep into Russian territory, that the Russian defenses in Kursk region were disorganized and had completely broken down, things of that kind. And a lot of this has been reproduced by other people, and as I said, it's given a very dramatic feel to the way in which events in Kursk region have been taking place. Now, Uriba is not the only party that has been doing this, and on what I think is relatively little evidence, others have joined in, and all kinds of exaggerated and, in my opinion, almost certainly inflated theories have been expressed and about what the actual state of events is and about what is going on. I think always the right place to start is to look at what the militaries of the two sides are saying. Now, for the moment, the Ukrainians are saying nothing. This is, by the way, very common when the Ukrainians conduct operations of this sort. They tend to be as quiet as possible. But the Russians, by contrast, and I'm talking now about official Russian authorities, they are providing us with quite a lot of information. Now, yesterday, there were a series of meetings in the Kremlin about the situation in Kursk region. It's important to say, by the way, that the claims that were circulating yesterday and the day before, that Putin had met with members of the Security Council, that the Russian Security Council, the top decision-making body in Russia, had been called into emergency session to discuss the situation in Kursk region, turned out to be wrong. Two meetings yesterday did take place. One was a routine meeting of the Russian government, which had obviously been prepared for a long time. This is a meeting which Putin attended, which looked at various economic issues. It did touch on the Kursk situation, but it was clearly, if you read the Kremlin's readout, not originally organized to discuss that topic. And then there was a second meeting, which is the meeting that matters, which was a meeting between Putin and his top law enforcement officials. And this is not a meeting of the Security Council. It was a meeting that was convened specifically to discuss the situation in Kursk region, and only the military and security people attended. The political officials, who are major players in the Security Council, people like Prime Minister Mishustin, Deputy Chair Medvedev, the head of the Federation Council, Valentina Matviyenko, Volodin, the Speaker of the Duma. Anyway, they did not attend this meeting. As I said, this was purely a meeting bringing together people from the security services and the military. And the main speaker, apart from Putin himself, was Gerasimov, though another participant in the meeting was Shoigu, and Shoigu apparently provided provided this group of officials, senior officials, with a detailed report of the results of his trip to Iran and Azerbaijan. I've discussed it in recent programs, which of course relates to the events in the Middle East crisis. Importantly, that part of the report, the report that Shoigu provided, has not been published by the Kremlin, though the brief report that the Kremlin has provided does actually confirm that Shoigu did give this report. I actually wonder, and this is purely a guess, whether the meeting was originally organized to discuss the situation in the Middle East and the results of Shoigu's visits to Iran and to Azerbaijan. If the Russians are providing Iran with military technical assistance, air defense systems, radars, electronic warfare systems, and that sort of thing, and given that Shoigu had meetings with members of the top political and military leadership in Iran, it would make complete sense that Putin and some of his top officials, especially the officials in the military and security services, would want to be briefed by Shoigu about what happened. But anyway, over the course of this meeting, Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, who's also the overall military commander of the Russian forces engaged in the special military operation, was invited by video conference to provide a report about the situation in Kursk. And the very fact, by the way, that he was consulted by video conference tells us that Gerasimov is still very much on the scene. He's clearly not in Moscow. I would just say, by the way, that the meeting did not take place in the Kremlin. It took place in Putin's country residence at Novo-Ogaryovo. But anyway, Gerasimov, as I said, was not attending the meeting directly, though the Kremlin has provided us an image in which one can see Gerasimov reporting to these officials by video conference. And this is what Gerasimov said. On this occasion, we have the report apparently in full, and it is very short, and it reads as follows. At 5:30 a.m. on August 6th, units of the armed forces of Ukraine, numbering up to 1,000 people, went on the offensive with the aim of capturing a section of the territory of the Sudzha district of the Kursk region. The joint actions by the state border covering units, together with border guards and reinforcement units, airstrikes, missile forces, and artillery, stopped the enemy's advance into the territory of the Kursk direction. At present, units of Group of Forces North, together with border authorities of the Russian Federal Security Service, continue to destroy the enemy in areas just along the Russian-Ukrainian border. Enemy losses have amounted to 315 people, including at least 100 killed and 215 injured, with 54 armoured vehicles destroyed, including 7 tanks. We will complete the operation by defeating the enemy and reaching the state border. The report is over. That was all Gerasimov said. So he says that the Ukrainians have crossed the border, that the force amounted to 1,000 men in total. Apparently, they come from the 42nd Mechanized Assault Brigade, and they cross the border, and a significant proportion of these forces, around a third of them, according to Gerasimov, have either been killed or wounded. including 100 of them who have been killed, a very high rate of losses. Large numbers of Ukrainian armored vehicles have been destroyed, including 7 tanks. And the enemy's advance, according to Gerasimov, has been stopped, though he didn't make it at all clear where that has happened. And then over the next couple of hours, we've had more reports, this time from the Russian Defense Ministry. They provided us with further updates about the military situation in Kursk region. These reports, by the way, are being published separately from the Defense Ministry's reports about the situation on the main line of contact in the area of the special military operation. But the very latest report, the one that came out early this morning, reads as follows. Units of the North Group of Forces, along with units of the Russian Federal Security Service, continue to eliminate armed Ukrainian formations in Sudzha and Korenovo districts of Kursk, immediately adjacent to the border between Russia and Ukraine. Over the past 24 hours, active actions by the State Border Covering Force, along with border guard units, reinforcement units and arrived reserves, air and missile strikes and artillery fire have prevented the enemy from advancing. Fire damage has been inflicted on the located Ukrainian manpower and hardware clusters. Attempts of separate units to get to the depth of territories in Kursk direction were foiled. Aviation strikes are delivered at the approaching Ukrainian reserves on the territory of Sumy region. Over the past 24 hours, Ukrainian losses have amounted to up to 400 Ukrainian troops and 32 units of armoured hardware, including 1 tank, 4 armoured personnel carriers, 3 infantry fighting vehicles, and 24 Cossack armoured fighting vehicles. Since the beginning of battles in Kursk direction, Ukrainian losses have amounted to up to 660 Ukrainian troops, 82 units of armoured hardware, including 8 tanks, 12 armoured personnel carriers, 6 infantry fighting vehicles, 55 armoured fighting vehicles, and 1 counter-obstacle vehicles. The operation to neutralise the Ukrainian units is in progress. So that's what the Russians are saying. They're telling us, in effect, that they have the situation under control, that the Ukrainians have tried to break in, that their advances, however, have been blocked, their further advances have been blocked, and that Russian forces are now being moved to the area, basically to contain this Ukrainian advance, push it back across the border, and though the Ukrainians do have forces in reserve, the Russians are now attacking them on Ukrainian territory in Sumy region. And this is what the Russians have told us. And I think that this has to be the starting point of our understanding what has happened. Now, is the information the Russians are providing reconcilable with the various photographic and film evidence that we have seen? Yes, I think it is. I think that it's clear to me it's clear to me, or at least I believe, that this is what has happened. A Ukrainian force did indeed cross the border. It appears to have been a full brigade, and perhaps there are 2 other brigades across the border, ready to move. So we're talking about a significant force, perhaps 10,000 men in total. And as I said, they've been trying to move across the border, and following the pattern that the Ukrainians have shown earlier in the war, in the Kharkiv offensive of 2022, the Kherson offensive in 2022, the second half of the Zaporozhye summer offensive of 2023. The Ukrainians, when they do advance, they try to do so in small groups, what are called by the Russians sabotage and reconnaissance groups. These move very fast along the country roads, trying to push through. They sometimes push through villages, and they try in this way to disorganize and unbalance the Russian defenses, whilst the main forces try to follow up behind them. Now, this tactic can work, and it did work during the 2022 Kharkiv offensive, if Russian defenses are thin and if the Russians are not really prepared to mount a full defense. When the Russians do decide to defend, and when they start deploying forces to try to block Ukrainian advances, then this style of conducting an attack not only fails, but fails with very heavy losses. And that perhaps explains why Ukrainian losses over the last couple of days, according to the Russians, has escalated to over 600 men, and why Group of Forces North this morning is claiming that around 40% of the initial force that crossed the border on the 6th of August and over the next couple of days has already been destroyed. Because it's clear that the Russians are indeed putting up resistance, that they're pushing the Ukrainians back. In fact, there's been comments from Russian officials that the Ukrainians are no longer advancing, that in fact they are actually being pushed back. Andrei Belostotsky, who is the acting deputy governor of Kursk region, has said that the enemy has not advanced deep into the territory of Russia's Kursk region. On the contrary, it has begun retreating. Well, that may be so. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of fog of war going on, but certainly it does seem that over the previous couple of hours, the Ukrainians did attempt to capture two specific villages, but they were forced back, and there's pictures of the Ukrainian armoured vehicles having been destroyed. But because there are small groups of Ukrainian soldiers scattered over a wide area, the impression is created that the Ukrainians are present everywhere, which of course is true, but they are not necessarily present in force. And with Russian forces being accumulating rapidly in this area, being brought from inside Russia, we see the reports about reserves being sent to this area by the Russian military. It's likely at some point that not only will the Ukrainians be blocked, but it's quite likely, in fact, I think it's a certainty, that the Ukrainians will indeed eventually be pushed back. So, what has happened? What is the rationale of all of this? Now, I said that the Western media has not wanted to cover this story very well. They haven't wanted to discuss this incursion at all. There have been some comments, however. This is one comment that I've read in the Financial Times. Analysts questioned, this is the Financial Times, analysts questioned the effectiveness of the Kursk operation at a time when Ukraine's army is already struggling to defend a front line that stretches more than 1,000 kilometers with limited human and material resources. Given defensive pressures elsewhere, the strategic rationale for this operation at this time is difficult to fathom, said Ryan, the retired Australian Army Major General. Lee of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, said it was unlikely that Ukraine's brazen incursion would have a significant impact on the course of the war. A limited operation might be able to achieve limited goals, but a more ambitious operation carries greater risks. And indeed, as we will see, the Russians are not diverting forces from the front lines to contain this operation. On the contrary, they appear to have it under control with the available reserves that they have. And on the front lines elsewhere, their advance continues. So, what is the objective of this Ukrainian operation? Now, some have suggested that it's all about getting the Russians to divert forces from the front lines. And in fact, there's been a comment to this effect in TASS. A Russian military official, Mr. Grachev, has suggested that the main purpose of the Ukrainians is to get a group of forces north to redeploy troops from Volchansk and Lipsy to contain this Ukrainian advance. But again, I have to say, there is no evidence that this is happening, and the Russians have enough forces to deal with this incursion, and they are doing so. I am going to suggest that there is in fact one very straightforward objective behind this entire operation, that it is one which moreover fits fully within the pattern of what the Ukrainians have been trying to do at various other points in this conflict. Now, if you go to a map of the area, you will see that beyond, some distance beyond the small town of Suja, where much of the fighting is going on, but along the main road from Suja towards the provincial capital, the regional capital of Kursk, you see that there is a body of water and a small town, actually settlement, called Kurchatov. And Kurchatov is where the Kursk nuclear power plant is located. Now, Kurchatov actually is a major strategic location. It is named after Igor Kurchatov, who was the Soviet scientist who was the overall head of the Soviet Union's equivalent of the Manhattan Project, the project which eventually resulted in 1949 in the Soviet Union acquiring its first nuclear bomb. And Kurchatov continued to administer or have overall responsibility for the Soviet nuclear weapons program in the early 1950s, though he eventually died in the mid-1950s as a result of radiation poisoning. He is not, it should be said, a particularly well-known personality in the West. Something which, by the way, is inexplicable given his overall importance within the Soviet military scientific community. His prestige has perhaps been overshadowed by that of one of his subordinates, Andrei Sakharov, who was in overall charge of the hydrogen bomb program and who subsequently became a prominent Soviet dissident, and by Khariton, another important Soviet scientist who, however, worked directly under Kurchatov. Now, the point is that Kurchatov has given his name to a number of Soviet towns, one in Kazakhstan, for example, where Soviet nuclear bombs were developed and tested, and any town that bears his name almost certainly is connected in some form with the Soviet Union's and presumably Russia's military, industrial, technological, nuclear weapons development programs. And just next door, as part of this town, there is, of course, the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, Ukraine has attacked the Kursk nuclear power plant on previous occasions. There have been drone attacks against the nuclear power plant in the past. The Russians have complained publicly that there were sabotage attempts by Ukrainian saboteurs at the nuclear power plant, the Kursk nuclear power plant in the past. I remember being surprised that this complaint by the Russians about this sabotage attempt by the Ukrainians on the Kursk nuclear power plant had attracted so little attention in the West. And to cut a long story short, I believe that the objective of the Kursk operation, the Ukrainian Kursk operation, is to capture Kurchatov and the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, it may appear, if one looks at these maps close up, that the distance between Sudzha, where a lot of the current fighting is going on, Sudzha is very close to the border, and Kurchatov is quite long, quite great, but in fact and in practice, it is not. It would mean in peaceful conditions, the drive from Sudzha to Kurchatov would just take perhaps at most a few hours. So it is well within distance of these places. And I think, as I said, that the Ukrainian objective is to reach Kurchatov and to capture the nuclear power plant there, and perhaps the other laboratories and other facilities, scientific facilities that exist there. And this is completely consistent with what the Ukrainians have done on multiple occasions in the past. I've previously spoken about the fact that the Russians have complained that the Ukrainians have conducted attacks on the Kursk nuclear power plant. That, of course, is well known. But the Ukrainians have also conducted attacks, many attacks, and this is, of course, a matter of public record, on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. In fact, they're continuing to make threats to launch attacks to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. They conducted some months ago an offensive in Belgorod region, trying to capture the town of Belgorod, or at least approach the town of Belgorod. I was contacted by a source who told me that the Ukrainian objective was to capture a nuclear weapons facility near to Belgorod, where tactical nuclear weapons were stored. Russian tactical nuclear weapons were stored. I was incredulous when I read the report. I couldn't believe that the Ukrainians would do something as reckless as that, or attempt something as reckless as that. But it turned out almost certainly that the source was correct, and that was indeed the Ukrainian objective. And of course, a couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainians launched drone attacks against the Russian Voronezh radars further south, which form part of Russia's air defense, a ballistic missile defense system, its early warning system against missile attacks, ICBM attacks by the United States. So an attempt to seize Kurchatov, to seize the nuclear power station there, to capture the scientists, maybe, and the facilities, the military scientific facilities there, is completely within the pattern of what the Ukrainians have been trying to do. And I think that this is clearly the objective that the Ukrainians set themselves in this attack. Now, Kurchatov almost certainly is very well protected by the Russians. I don't myself think that there is any prospect that the Ukrainians will be able to reach Kurchatov or capture the nuclear power plant or do any of these things. I think that the Russians are indeed deploying troops quickly to the area to contain this attack. But it's far and away the most plausible thing that the Ukrainians are trying to do. The Ukrainians know, militarily speaking, that the war is lost, as I have been discussing in various programs recently. The Ukrainians have given signs that they understand that in some way. They've been talking about negotiations. They've been reaching out to the Chinese. They've been talking to the Vatican. They don't, however, show any willingness or ability to make concessions. And at the same time, they are almost certainly desperately looking for some dramatic thing that they can do, some big throw of the dice that can turn the situation round and bring them back in a position where they can push the Russians into dramatic concessions, reversing the course of the war. And of course, if one thinks in this kind of way, then all of these various things that the Ukrainians have been doing, the threats against the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the attempts to capture the facility housing the tactical nuclear warheads near Belgorod, the attacks on the radar station at Armavir, the attacks on the Kursk nuclear power plant, the attempt to advance towards Kurchatov specifically, all make complete sense. Now, moreover, we can see how big the gamble the Ukrainians are taking is and how much they've invested in this particular gamble from the fact that the attack force that they have launched into Kursk region appears to consist of all the forces, the various brigades, the 3 brigades that they had previously positioned along their border with Belarus. Now, the Ukrainians have apparently been very worried in the past that Russian forces might repeat what happened in 2022, advance into Ukraine and perhaps towards Kiev itself, across the border from Belarus. And for that reason, the Ukrainians have maintained significant forces along the Belarus border. But it was detected some weeks ago that they were redeploying these forces eastward. Most people, myself included, assumed that they were being rushed to try to stabilize the situation on the line of contact, which would have been the logical and rational thing to do. But instead, as we see, they've deployed these forces in this reckless attempt to try to break deep into Kursk region and advance towards Kursk city and to try to capture Kurchatov itself. Now, where are we? Now, there are reports that the Ukrainians have made an attempt to capture a village called Korenovo. They've apparently been pushed back from there. They've also reports that they made an attempt to try and capture another village called Lvov, which is actually located not that far from Kurchatov, but the reports are that they have been pushed back from there also. And, well, there's some fighting going on around Suja, a relatively small town, by the way. I saw that the military summary channel referred to it as a big town, but Suja has a population of around 6,400. So yes, it's a town, but hardly a huge place. It's half the size of Krasnogorovka, for example, or of Chasov Yar. Anyway, there's fighting going on the outskirts of Suja, which is quite close to the border. But my own sense is that the operation to capture Kurchatov has failed. That already we can see that the resistance of the Russians was too well organized and too strong, and that the Ukrainians have not been able to break through so far to Kurchatov, and that with every day that passes, more Russian reinforcements will arrive in the area. The Russians are concentrating more aircraft, helicopters, apparently large numbers of Kharmov-52 helicopter gunships are operating in the area. The Ukrainians do not have any air defense to speak of in this area because, after all, they're operating on Russian territory. So helicopter gunships can roam over the skies effectively at will. There was one unusual incident where a Kharmov-52 collided with an Ukrainian FPV drone. The helicopter crashed, though the crew apparently survived, and this has been much talked about, and pictures of it have been circulating in the Ukrainian media, but this was clearly an unusual event and not one that is likely to recur very often. So the deadly Kharmov-52s are operating, as are the Sukhoi 25s. And as I said, with every day that passes, Ukraine's prospects of reaching Kurchatov, it seems to me, grow dim. And of course, Russian officials, Gerasimov, the other official that I spoke about, are now telling us that Belostotsky are all telling us that the Ukrainians are in fact and indeed being pushed back. And I would have thought that the importance of Kurchatov is such that the Russians will indeed be successful fairly soon, not only in parrying this Ukrainian attack, but in pushing it back. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians are suffering very high losses of men and machines trying to carry out this reckless operation. And there are Ukrainian commentators who are absolutely furious about this. You can find all sorts of examples, but there's a Ukrainian commentator called Tatarigami, and he says that the situation in the Pokrovsk direction is critical, with defences in several areas collapsed and yet to stabilise, largely due to a shortage of personnel, diverting nearly brigade to launch an assault on Kursk Oblast, which lacks strategic sense, borders on mental instability. But, well, in fact, it's more than one brigade. It looks as if it might be as many as 3. But it's what one would expect from the duo of Zelensky and Budanov, who are, I suspect, the authors of this particular plan. And anyway, there we are. We will see what happens over the next couple of hours. I suspect it will take several days before we start to get clarity about the situation. But as I said, with more and more Russian forces now being brought into play, even though it's clear that the Ukrainians do still have some reserves in the area, I think it is only a matter of time before the operation is not only brought to a stop, the Ukrainian operation is brought to a stop, but it is that it is thrown back and reversed. Now, we come here back to the United States and its role in this affair. The Americans say that they were not informed in advance about it, and that is another reason, by the way, if that is true, why I think the attack on Kurchatov, the objective of this operation is Kurchatov, because I have to believe that even a government as obsessed with Russia as the current American government is, would not countenance an attempt to attack a Russian nuclear facility with all the enormous risks that go with that. So anyway, it might even be true. Let's go back a couple of weeks to that mysterious telephone call between Belousov and the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. We know that Belousov telephoned Lloyd Austin and told Lloyd Austin that the Ukrainians were planning to do something absolutely crazy, and what were the Americans going to do about it? And Lloyd Austin apparently told the Russians that the United States was not in any way involved, and that it apparently told the Ukrainians, if you're really planning to do this, then don't even think of it. Now, there's been speculation that I touched on in my video yesterday, that what the Ukrainians had been planning to do was an assassination attempt on President Putin, specifically, according to some reports in the Russian media, an assassination attempt on Putin and Belousov during the Navy Day celebrations which have recently taken place in St. Petersburg. I wonder whether what actually passed between Belousov and Lloyd Austin is that the Russians got wind of the fact that the Ukrainians were planning some kind of operation against a Russian nuclear weapons facility, and contacted the Americans to warn them about it, and asked the Americans whether that was the case, with the Americans saying that it was not, and whether this explains why, after the Americans are supposed to have told the Ukrainians under no circumstances even think of doing something like this, the Ukrainians launched this operation, apparently without telling the Americans. At least that's what the American media is telling us. It might not be true, but let's just follow this line of thought for a moment. And that might also explain why the Americans are now asking the Ukrainians, what is this all about? Is it because the Americans share my suspicions that, following up on those Russian warnings, that the Ukrainians are indeed up to some reckless operation to try to reach Kurchatov, capture the facilities there, capture the nuclear power plant there, disrupt in some way the Russian nuclear weapons programs. Just speculating. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. But that then brings us back to this extraordinary paradox of American support for Ukraine. Americans do seem to me to be embarrassed in some way about this affair. I've already spoken about how the Western media is not covering this story at all. Could it be because they've been told not to? They've been warned that this is a very sensitive story, that the Western powers are not at all happy about this whole operation, that it is dangerous and ill-conceived and reckless, and that the Americans are indeed impressing on the Ukrainians, even as I make this program, that the United States isn't at all happy about what the Ukrainians are doing. Well, maybe, but if that is so, then how does one explain the fact that the United States, despite supporting this reckless, irresponsible, dangerous government, which is doing all of these desperate and reckless and potentially extremely dangerous things, nonetheless continues to give it effectively unqualified support? Does this remind you of something else? Does this remind you? It certainly reminds me of the same pattern of unqualified American support for the Netanyahu government in Israel, which carries out assassinations, which conducts airstrikes against Iranian embassy buildings in Damascus, carries out assassinations of the chief negotiator of Hamas at the very moment when those negotiations to try and achieve a ceasefire in Gaza are underway, and does so in the heart of the Iranian capital on the Iranian president's inauguration day. It's exactly the same pattern. The United States cannot distance itself, doesn't want to distance itself from a government, be it Ukrainian or Israeli, which it privately complains is behaving in a dangerous, irresponsible, and reckless way. Well, there it is. It's not, as I said, for me to try to square this circle for the United States. Maybe, and I know there are going to be some people who think this, the United States has been fully up for this whole operation all along. The idea that they were not supportive of this Ukrainian operation in Kursk region is no basis, that the Ukrainians did in fact discuss and with the US, and that the US gave the green light for it. That's perfectly possible. Maybe the US was implicated previously in the murder of Haniyeh, as the Iranians themselves say. Maybe all this, maybe that is the actual truth. I'm not saying. But assuming, and this is my assumption, which, by the way, I ought to make clear is also my belief, assuming that the United States really was kept in ignorance by the Israelis of the attack on Haniyeh, and by the Ukrainians of the attack in Kursk, and assuming also, which I most definitely do believe, that the objective of the Ukrainian attack in Kursk is indeed to try to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant and the scientific facilities in Kurchatov, which I am sure exist, by the way. Well, assuming all that is the case, then isn't it bizarre that the United States cannot bring itself to bring under control an errant ally which is behaving so recklessly and so dangerously. The tail is indeed wagging the dog and is doing so in a most dangerous way. Anyway, let's move on and let's just discuss more things that are taking place on the battlefronts in Ukraine, because in spite of the fact that, as I said, the events in Kursk are attracting the most attention, the realities are on the battlefronts that things continue much as they have, and that the Russian advances are indeed continuing and, in fact, are accelerating. Now, over the course of the last 24 hours, there have been reports that the Russians have captured the village of Sergeyevka, which is located to the west of Zhelanye, which is now the village of Zhelanye, the bigger village of Zhelanye, which is also under sustained Russian attack. In fact, the latest reports say that most of Zhelanye has actually fallen under Russian control, and that Zhelanye itself is about to fall. There are also further reports that the Russians have pushed forward southwards from Novoselivka Persha, that they're advancing towards some villages to the south of Novoselivka Persha and heading towards the E50 road, cutting Ukrainian communications between the village which the Ukrainians are currently defending of Karlovka, important village on that road, and the town of Solidovo, and ultimately Pokrovsk itself. And there are also reports that the Russians have captured or are about to capture the village of Ivanovka, which is located to the north of the TO511 road from Progress to Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, and that they're also close to attacking and capturing the village of Lysychne, which lies between Ivanovka, which the Russians supposedly have now captured, and the village of Timofeevka further north, which the Russians unequivocally have actually captured. And there are even reports which perhaps are not fully reliable, that following the fall of Veselye, which is to the south of the TO511 road, and Ivanivka to the north of that road, that the Russians have driven up the road and have now reached the outskirts of the village of Grodivka, which is located further along the road. This is a large village, but it is still, despite some claims referring to it as a town, it is still a village. And of course, if Grodivka falls, there is nothing, no inhabited settlement left before the Russians arrive in Mirnograd itself, Mirnograd being, of course, a suburb of Pokrovsk. So, very dramatic news in the Pokrovsk area. And I would say, by the way, that there's also reports that the encirclement of Ukrainian troops east of Zhelanye, between Zhelanye and Novoselivka Persha, is now in effect a cauldron, that with the Russians now in control of roughly 2/3 of Zhelanye. As I said, it does seem as if this village is about to fall, and in control of Novoselivka Persha, and with the Russians having pushed south of Novoselivka Persha, the Ukrainian troops in this area between these two villages are in effect encircled, and that there is in fact no way out for them. So, dramatic events in the Pokrovsk area. The Russian advance in the Pokrovsk area continues unabated. The Russians continue to advance there, and they continue to advance fast. Now, news in the Toretsk area is equally dramatic. I spoke, I think it was yesterday, about how Russian troops have raised the Russian flag over the school building, over a school building in the village or small town of Niu-York, located south of Toretsk, one of the major fortified positions that the Ukrainians have. Now, today there are claims that the whole of New York has fallen under Russian control. I can't confirm this, but nonetheless, it's plausible. When the Russians start raising flags, it's usually a sign that a village is indeed about to fall. Interestingly and importantly, the military unit of the Russian army that has captured, or may have captured, New York, has been identified as a motorized rifle brigade. From memory, I think it's the 59th Motorized Rifle Brigade, but I may be completely wrong about the number. Anyway, that looks like it's a normal, regular unit of the Russian armed forces. In fact, and in reality, it is the reorganized Somalia battalion, one of the most famed battalions of the Donetsk militia, a battalion that has been in constant operation, in battle, in the Donetsk region since the fighting which began in 2014. And this is further confirmation of a number of things. Firstly, that the Donetsk militia has been completely reorganized and assimilated into the Russian army, so that units of the Donetsk militia have now been given Russian designations, regular Russian army designations. But it also highlights a further point which I have made many times, which is that so far the heavy mechanized units of the Russian army have not been committed in force into the battle, that most of the fighting that still takes place on the front lines in Ukraine is carried out by paratroopers, Marines of the Russian regular army, but not regular heavy infantry, supplemented by Chechen fighters, some of whom, by the way, have been sent to the Kursk area, and Wagner and other private contractors, and apparently a significant number of those have also been redeployed to the Kursk area, some of them allegedly from Belarus. And lastly, the Donbass militia. And we see that it is the Donbass militia that has apparently captured New York, assuming, of course, that this village is indeed fully under Russian control, which we will probably get confirmation of within the next couple of days, if it has in fact actually happened. What is indisputable is that the Russians do now control most of the territory south of Toretsk itself. And there are reports that the Russians are now in the process of advancing from New York and from other places around Toretsk towards another village which lies basically between New York and the recently captured village of Zalizny, that the Russians are moving towards capturing another village, the last remaining village in this area, which the Ukrainians still control, which is the village of Nelipivka. If Nelipivka falls, and the Russians do gain control of it, then any remaining Ukrainian troops located south of Toretsk are in effect surrounded. My own guess is that the Ukrainians have actually withdrawn most of their troops from this area already. But if you want to talk about a cauldron in Toretsk, it looks as if, well, there are some reasons now for thinking that we are close to seeing precisely that kind of cauldron emerge. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. The Russians making big progress in the Toretsk area. And there's been more reports about the fighting in Konstantinovka, village in the south of Donbass, the village north of Vuhledar. The latest reports from the 79th Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian army, which have been tasked with defending Konstantinovka, they're basically suggesting that they're about to give up. They're saying that they should basically pull back from Konstantinovka, withdraw westwards to other more defendable positions, because the Russians around Konstantinovka are too numerous and too strong. Very despairing comments for what has been, up to now, one of Ukraine's most steadfast brigades. And there are scattered reports that the Russians have increased their foothold in central Chasiv Yar. There's been another article today, by the way, about the very difficult situation that the Ukrainians face along the contact line in The Guardian, which seems to hint that the situation in Chasiv Yar is becoming indeed very difficult for the Ukrainians. And it speculates about the effect of the loss of Chasiv Yar, though it doesn't go into any details. I'm not going to repeat this article because it is essentially a rehash of the same things that were said in the Financial Times article, which I discussed a few days ago. Anyway, so there we are. This is the situation in Ukraine today. My own view, and I share this with others, Andrew Karibko, for example, the Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama, others, that this Kursk operation is a desperate last throw. The Ukrainians know that they're going down. Surrender for them is unthinkable. The ideological and political obstacles discussed by Stephen Bryan in that article in Asia Times, which he wrote as far back as the 2nd of July, are overwhelming, that they're not prepared to negotiate seriously. They want desperately to try to find some way of freezing the conflict. They understand that they have no leverage over the Russians. So they made a desperate last throw with the remaining effective units that they still have to try to capture the Kursk nuclear power station and the facilities in Kurchatov, and hope that by doing that, it will gain them leverage over the Russians. I think already the signs are that this operation, this very reckless operation, has failed. And I think that the Russians do have the situation under control, as they say. And I think that far from deterring the Russians or intimidating the Russians, this operation is going to infuriate them. And already Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, Russia's arch hawk, is now publishing further statements saying that the Kursk operation proves the correctness of the point he's been making all along, that the only way to finally resolve the problem that Ukraine has represented for Russia, at least since the 2014 Maidan uprising, is to capture Kiev itself, extinguish the government there, and move forward towards reassimilating the entire territory back into Russia. And I think that this event in Kursk region is indeed going to strengthen the hand of people like Medvedev in the higher councils of the Russian government. And, well, it might, for all I know, cause some misgivings, further misgivings in the United States. And given the likelihood that we are going to get some kind of change of administration in Washington, irrespective of who wins the election in November, already the new Democratic team seems to be making some signs that its approach is going to be different from that of the current administration. Anyway, we'll see. It might be that by infuriating the United States, or alarming some people at least in the United States, the Ukrainian government, far from strengthening its position diplomatically and politically, has further weakened it. Anyway, that's my analysis of the situation as of today. It may be that as we get more information over the next couple of days, and as the situation becomes clearer, I might perhaps change my views. But I'm fairly sure that the Kursk nuclear power plant and Kurchatov itself are the Ukrainian objective. I'm fairly sure also that the operation has already failed. I think that explains the reticence of the Western media, the annoyance of the United States, and, well, we will see what happens next. And, of course, we still wait to see what the Iranians are going to do in the Middle East. But anyway, this is where I end my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can get all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.